On a freezing February day in 1957, a battered cardboard box was found in the woods outside Philadelphia. Inside was the body of a small boy, bruised, malnourished, discarded like trash. For decades, no one knew his name. No family claimed him. He became known only as the boy in the box. America's unknown child. What followed was one of the longest, most haunting mysteries in American history. A 65-year search for identity, justice, and truth. And in the end, when his name was finally revealed, the questions only grew darker. It was February 25, 1957, and Philadelphia's winter still had its claws deep in the city. The air was so cold, it stung the skin. Frost clung to the barren branches of the trees, and the ground along Susquehanna Road, a quiet, winding stretch in the Fox Chase neighborhood, was muddy with patches of snow. This was not a place people visited often. The road was narrow, surrounded by thick brush, weeds, and woods. For most of the city, it was just another forgotten corner, hidden away from daily life. But on that day, it became the center of one of the most haunting mysteries America has ever known. The first person to see the box was a young man, out in the woods to check his muskrat traps. Now here's the thing, he wasn't supposed to be there. Trapping in that area was illegal, and if the police caught him, he could face charges. As he moved quietly through the brush, his eyes caught something that didn't belong. A cardboard box. It was large, sitting awkwardly among the weeds. Weathered, but not yet destroyed by rain, as though it had been left only recently. Curiosity pulled him closer. The box had printing on the side. It had once contained a J.C. Penney baby BASSINE2. The young man hesitated. He bent down, lifted the flap of the box, and froze. Inside was the small, naked body of a boy. The boy was wrapped in a plaid blanket. His tiny frame was battered, showing signs of malnourishment. His hair had been crudely chopped with clumps, unevenly cut as if someone had tried to disguise him. His eyes were closed, his lips pale. He looked to be between 4 and 6 years old. It was a sight so terrible. The young man stumbled backward in shock. But then, fear overtook horror. If he reported this, the police would question why he was there, his traps, his illegal activity. So instead of calling the authorities, he chose silence. He left the boy in the box, alone in the woods. Days passed. The cardboard box sat in the cold, holding its terrible secret. Not long after, another man, this time a college student from La Salle University, was driving through the area. He noticed something strange in the underbrush. The same box. Curiosity made him stop. He walked through the weeds, opened it, and what he saw inside would haunt him forever. The small body of a child, bruised, beaten, left for dead, discarded like garbage. Unlike the first man, the student did not stay silent. After wrestling with shock and fear, he went to the police. This time, the authorities listened. When Philadelphia police reached Susquehanna Road, they knew immediately this was no ordinary crime scene. They carefully removed the boy from the box, wrapping him with care as though even in death he deserved dignity. The sight devastated hardened officers. Some were fathers themselves, and the idea of a child left this way broke something inside them. The area was searched thoroughly. Detectives combed the weeds, the ditches, every patch of frozen mud. They found footprints, tire tracks, a few scattered items of clothing, but nothing that directly identified the child. The coroner's examination painted a grim picture. The boy weighed only 30 pounds, far less than average for his age. He bore bruises, scars, and signs of repeated abuse. His nails were trimmed. His hair recently and unevenly cut, with strands still clinging to his body. The coroner believed he had died from a blow to the head, and yet there were no signs of who he was. No missing child report that matched him. No frantic parents searching. This boy was a ghost. Alive one day, gone the next. Detectives made a bold decision. They photographed the boy's body, cleaned, positioned with his eyes open, and released. The images to the public it was shocking, controversial, but they were desperate. Thousands of flyers were printed and distributed across Philadelphia and beyond. Post offices, police stations, shops, and even gas bills carried the child's haunting image. The city begged, "Do you know this boy? Does anyone know who he is?" But no answer came. By nightfall, the newspapers had given him a name, the boy in the box. Not John, not Michael, not even unknown male, just the boy in the box. Because in that moment, he had no identity, no family to claim him, no voice to tell his story. And so began one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, a search not just for a killer, but for a name. As detectives gathered in their offices that night, staring at the haunting photographs, one question echoed through every corner of the Philadelphia Police Department. Who is this boy? And perhaps the more chilling question, why has no one come looking for him? The discovery of the boy's body had shaken Philadelphia to its core. But for the police, one thing was clear. If they were to solve this case, they first had to give the child a name. Without identity, there could be no justice. In a controversial move, detectives decided to release the boy's morgue photographs to the public. They carefully washed his body. They combed what was left of his unevenly chopped hair. They even propped open his eyelids, hoping that if people could see his face, his eyes, they might remember him. It was disturbing, shocking, even heartbreaking, but the detectives justified it. If this were your child, wouldn't you want someone to recognize him? The photos were distributed everywhere, to newspapers, police stations, and across state lines. Soon, over 400,000 flyers were printed. They were stuffed into utility bills, plastered onto telephone poles, handed out door to door. The city rallied. Philadelphia was haunted by the thought that somewhere, a family must be missing their little boy. But as the days passed, no family stepped forward. No one claimed him. No one recognized him. It was as if the boy had been erased from existence long before his body was ever placed in that box. The Philadelphia Police Department pulled out all the stops. Dozens of detectives were assigned to the case. They followed up on hundreds of phone calls and letters. They compared the boy's description to every missing child report in the region, and then across the entire country. Each lead brought a moment of hope, and each lead collapsed into dead ends. Investigators studied every detail of the crime scene. The box itself had once contained a J.C. Penney baby bassinet. Only a few were sold in the region, and police tracked down every single buyer. None led to the boy. The blanket, plaid, cheap, ordinary. Mass-produced. Impossible to trace. The boy's hair, clearly cut at home, uneven, strands stuck to his small body. Someone had cut it just before his death, perhaps to change his appearance. And yet, there was no identity. Neighbors and locals began speculating. Was the boy an abandoned orphan? A runaway child killed by strangers? Or, and this thought was the most chilling, had he been murdered by the very people who were supposed to love him? Police leaned toward the last. The signs of abuse were clear: bruises, scars, malnourishment. This boy had not known kindness. In life, whoever killed him hadn't just committed murder. They had silenced years of suffering. Within weeks, the case spread beyond Philadelphia. Newspapers across America carried the story of the boy in the box. Radio stations begged listeners to call in with any information. Even FBI agents took an interest, though they too came up empty-handed. Tips poured in from across the country. People thought they recognized him in Michigan, in Florida, in New York, but each tip ended the same way: no match. For the detectives, the case quickly turned into an obsession. Some officers admitted they would stare at the boy's photo every night, asking silently, "Who are you? Why won't anyone claim you?" They began to call him not just the boy in the box, but America's unknown child. And for the people of Philadelphia, the case carried a chilling thought. If this child could vanish so completely, with no one to claim him, could it happen to others too? By spring of 1957, months had passed since the discovery. The boy's face had been seen by millions, his photograph printed in every corner of the country. And still, no one came forward. It was as if he had never existed. And for the investigators, one fear began to creep in. What if this case could never be solved? What if America's unknown child would remain a mystery forever? By the summer of 1957, the photographs had been mailed. The flyers had been distributed. The story had run on newspapers and radio from coast to coast. And still, no one had claimed the boy. The police had expected tears, a frantic family, maybe even a guilty parent stepping forward in remorse. But what they got instead was silence. The silence was the most disturbing part. A child doesn't simply vanish from a family without someone noticing. A mother, a father, a neighbor, a teacher. But this boy, it was as though he had lived in shadows, as though no one even dared admit they knew him. The case that had once electrified the nation began to fade. New crimes took the headlines. New scandals grabbed the public's attention, and slowly, the boy in the box was slipping away from memory. For most people, anyway, inside the Philadelphia Police Department, a handful of detectives refused to let the case die. One of them was Detective Remington Bristow. Bristow wasn't even officially assigned to the case anymore, but he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. He would keep the morgue photo in his desk, staring at it during long nights, asking the same question over and over: "Who are you?" For Bristow, this wasn't just another case file. It was personal. He once said, "Somewhere someone knows who this boy is, and until I find out, I can't rest." Bristow's obsession led him to strange places. Not far from where the boy's body was found, there was a foster home. Bristow became convinced that the answer lay there. The foster home was close enough. The children there fit the age range, and rumors swirled that not everything inside those walls was what it seemed. For years, Bristow kept circling back to that foster home, watching it, questioning it, building theories. But every time he tried to push the idea forward, he was met with dead ends, lack of evidence, or outright dismissal from his superiors. Still, he couldn't let it go. Meanwhile, the public had a complicated relationship with the case. The photographs of the boy had haunted thousands. People would admit years later that they couldn't sleep after seeing the child's lifeless eyes staring back at them from the newspapers. Some refused to even look. Others clipped the story and kept it in scrapbooks, as though afraid to forget. Boy had no name, but in some strange way, he belonged to everyone. Among the officers, guilt began to creep in. Many were fathers themselves. They thought of their own children, sleeping safely in warm beds, and then looked at the photo of the boy, alone in a cold box. Detectives began taking the case personally. They told themselves, if no one else will claim him, then we will. He is ours. And so the case files never gathered dust. Even as the years passed, someone was always flipping through them, hoping for something they missed. But time is a cruel enemy. As the 1960s arrived, the boy in the box case had become a cold case. A tragic story remembered by a few, forgotten by most. And yet, the legend of America's unknown child still whispered in the city. Children who grew up in Philadelphia would hear the story from their parents, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as a bedtime tragedy. The boy without a name had become a ghost of the city. But for detectives, like Remington Bristow, the boy was not a ghost, he was real. And Bristow believed with every ounce of his being that one day the truth would come out. What he didn't know was that his obsession would take him places darker than he could ever imagine. By the early 1960s, the case of the boy in the box had already taken on a mythic quality in Philadelphia. He wasn't just a victim anymore, he had become a symbol of the unknown, the forgotten, the voiceless. And as detectives searched for answers, theories began to multiply. The strongest theory, and the one that obsessed Detective Remington Bristow, was the foster home, just a short walk away from where the boy had been found. The home housed troubled children, runaways, and those placed there by the state. Bristow became convinced the boy came from that very house. It was close enough for the body to be dumped, without much risk. Some of the children there matched the boy's age, and neighbors had long whispered about odd things happening inside. Bristow even staged a mock auction years later, tricking his way into exploring the house. There, he claimed, he saw a bassinet similar to the one once packaged in the J.C. Penney box. For him, it was proof, but without hard evidence. The theory remained just that, a theory. Others believed the boy may have come from one of Philadelphia's many orphanages. The malnourishment, the neglect, the signs of abuse, all could fit with a child who had slipped through the cracks of the system. Still, when orphanage records were checked, no child matched the boy's description. Some detectives wondered, could he have been a runaway, picked up by a stranger who later killed him? But there were no reports of a child wandering alone in that bitter February cold. Another theory haunted investigators. What if the boy's own parents had killed him? It wasn't uncommon. Cases of child abuse leading to death, covered up by parents too afraid or ashamed to come forward, existed even back then. The freshly cut hair suggested an attempt to change his appearance. The careful trimming of his nails, the blanket, small signs that someone had cared, but also wanted to cover tracks. But if he had a family, where were they? And why had not a single relative, not even a distant one, come forward to say, I know that child? The police were desperate, and desperate cases attract desperate leads. A psychic claimed she could sense the boy's identity. Detectives, out of options, even followed her directions, only to find nothing. A truck driver swore he'd seen a boy like him at a diner weeks before. Investigators chased the lead for months, but it collapsed. A woman in another state believed he was her missing neighbor's son. It too went nowhere. Each time, detectives felt hope rise. only for it to collapse into despair. Over the years, theories piled up like dust on a forgotten shelf. The boy was an orphan. The boy was abandoned by travelers passing through. The boy was sold, trafficked, discarded. The boy was the secret child of a prominent family, hidden and silenced. The lack of answers made the theories grow stranger and darker with each passing year. And yet, not one theory gave them a name. By the mid-1960s, Philadelphia began to move on. The case still lingered in the background, an unsolved scar on the city's history. But new crimes, new tragedies, and new scandals pushed it out of the headlines. For most, the boy in the box was a ghost of another era. But for detectives like Remington Bristow, the boy was as real as ever. He refused to let go, chasing the foster home theory, the orphanage connections, every lead, no matter how faint. It consumed him. And it would, for the rest of his life. Theories had given them paths to follow, but without identity, every path led to the same dead end. And the haunting truth remained. The boy had no name, no history, no one to claim him. At least not yet, because decades later, science would catch up, and the case of America's unknown child would be reborn. As the 1960s unfolded, America was changing. The country was caught in waves of civil rights battles, political assassinations, and the looming shadow of war in Vietnam. In Philadelphia, new crimes demanded headlines every week: robberies, murders, scandals. And slowly, the story of the boy in the box slipped further into the shadows. For the public, he was fading into memory. But for some detectives, he was the one case they couldn't let go of. Officially, the case file grew cold. No new leads, no new suspects. But unofficially, it was still alive inside the hearts of those who had seen the boy. Detectives would quietly reopen the folder during late nights. They would run his details again against new missing children reports. And every time, nothing. No one embodied that obsession more than Detective Remington Bristow. Bristow's life was no longer separate from the case. The boy's photograph sat permanently on his desk. He carried copies of the flyer in his car. He would show strangers the image, asking, "Do you know this child? Have you seen him before?" For Bristow, the boy was not forgotten. He was family, a son he never had. Bristow's fixation on the foster home near the Discovery site only deepened. He became convinced the boy had lived there. He pointed out small coincidences: the bassinet, the proximity, the rumors of mistreatment inside. Even staged elaborate undercover moments, pretending to be interested in buying property, sneaking glimpses inside the home, speaking with neighbors. Each time, his gut told him he was close. But his superiors? They called it obsession. They warned him to move on. They said without evidence, it was a dead end. But Bristow couldn't let go. Years turned into decades. By the 1970s, the boy's case had become one of Philadelphia's oldest unsolved murders. Many of the original investigators retired. Some passed away. Others admitted they avoided the subject. The thought of the boy in the box was too painful to relive. Still, every so often, a new detective would stumble across the file, and curiosity would ignite again. But the longer the years passed, the colder the trail became. For the public, the boy in the box was becoming a ghost story. Parents would whisper it to children as a cautionary tale. Stay close. Don't wander off. Remember what happened to the boy in the box. But to newer generations, it was nothing more than an old legend. The photographs, once shocking, plastered across the nation, were fading, yellowed, Tucked into forgotten drawers, the boy's face was becoming just another unsolved picture. In history, for Bristow, however, it was the opposite. The deeper he chased the case, the more it consumed his personal life. Friends noticed he rarely spoke of anything else. Colleagues said he seemed tired, haunted. Some claimed the case ruined his marriage, his happiness, his chance at peace. But if you asked Bristow, he would always say the same thing. This boy deserves a name. And until he has one, I cannot stop. By the late 1970s, The Boy in the Box had been officially unsolved for 2 decades. And yet, the boy remained. His tiny grave was marked simply without a name. A place where detectives, journalists, and even strangers would sometimes leave flowers, as though he belonged to the whole city now. Philadelphia didn't speak of him often, but his ghost lingered in the silence, in the questions left unanswered. The case was cold. The trail was dead. But obsession has a way of breathing life into the lifeless, because even as the world moved on, science was catching up. And by the 1980s, whispers began again. Could new forensic technology finally give America's unknown child his identity? By the time the 1980s arrived, the case of the boy in the box had been cold for more than 20 years. For most, he was little more than a tragic headline from the past, but for detectives, journalists, and a few stubborn believers, the boy still waited for justice. And now, technology was beginning to offer them something they never had before: new ways to test old evidence. The 1980s were a turning point in criminal investigations. Fingerprint databases were becoming digitized. Hair and fiber analysis was gaining momentum. And for the very first time, DNA was beginning to be used in criminal cases. For investigators of the boy in the box, this meant a chance to re-examine every scrap of evidence. The box, the blanket, the boy's body itself. Perhaps science could reveal what memory and testimony had failed to give them. The cardboard box was studied again. It had once held a J.C. Penney bassinet. Investigators traced every single purchase in the Philadelphia area back in the 1950s. Dozens of families were interviewed. Some still had receipts. Others remembered the crib. And yet, none led to the boy. The blanket was analyzed. Its fibers were compared to hundreds of samples. It was mass-produced, making it nearly impossible to trace. Even the boy's body was studied again. His scars, his malnourishment, his freshly cut hair. Each detail told a story of suffering, but not of identity. For the first time, investigators attempted to use the boy's fingerprints in broader databases. They also created detailed dental charts, hoping a dentist somewhere might recognize the work or the lack of it. Thousands of dentists across Pennsylvania and beyond were contacted. Not one matched. The boy seemed to exist in a vacuum. No school records, no medical records, no dental visits. As though his short life had been lived entirely in the shadows. The 1980s also brought renewed media attention. Television crime shows and newspapers began to revisit the mystery. Some stations broadcast the boy's image again, urging the public, look at his face. Someone knows him. Someone remembers. Hotlines buzzed. Tips poured in. But as always, each lead ended in disappointment. The foster home theory returned again. Investigators circled back, interviewing new residents and caretakers. Rumors spread that the boy may have been a hidden child, a son born out of wedlock, or the victim of abusive parents who covered his death. Some detectives even suggested the possibility of trafficking, A horrifying idea, but one that explained why no one came forward. But once again, there was no hard proof. Just whispers, just theories, just endless frustration. By now, many of the original detectives were aging. Some had retired, others had passed away, but the case continued to gnaw at them. One officer admitted, "We have solved murders with no body, no witnesses, no weapon. And yet here, with a body, with evidence, with photographs, we have nothing, nothing but a nameless boy." The weight of failure pressed heavily on them. Even as science advanced, one constant remained: the boy's lonely grave, buried in a potter's field. His headstone bore no name, just 3 words: "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." Visitors would still come. Detectives, journalists, even strangers who would read about the case. They would leave flowers, toys, or prayers. The boy had no family to claim him. But the city, in its own way, had adopted him. The 1980s ended with frustration. Forensics had given them tools. Media had reignited interest. Investigators had chased every possible lead. And yet, the boy remained America's unknown child. But the 1990s were approaching. And with them, the birth of something revolutionary: DNA testing. Science was about to change everything. By the time the 1990s arrived, the boy in the box had been waiting for justice for more than 4 decades. Detectives had grown old. Witnesses had died. The city had nearly forgotten. But then, science gave investigators something they had never had before: DNA. For the first time in history, DNA was being used in American courtrooms. That it had the power to prove guilt, that it had the power to prove innocence. And, most importantly for cold cases, it had the power to give the dead their names back. For the case of the boy in the box, this was a miracle. After decades of dead ends, they finally had a tool that could speak when silence had reigned for so long. In 1998, after long debates and paperwork, investigators made a bold and emotional decision. They would exhume the boy's tiny body from his grave. On the day of the exhumation, detectives, officers, and even locals gathered in silence. Some bowed their heads. Others openly cried. The boy had been buried for more than 40 years. Now, for the first time, science was about to touch him from his remains. Forensic experts carefully collected DNA samples. Forensic labs went to work. Hair strands, teeth, bone fragments. All were tested, and slowly, a profile began to emerge. The first time in history, the boy in the box had a genetic fingerprint. He was no longer faceless in science. His very blood carried the answers detectives had begged for decades to find. With this profile, investigators now had something powerful. They could compare his DNA against relatives. If he had any living family, they might finally be found. The search began. The boy's DNA was compared against databases. Relatives of missing children were contacted. Families volunteered to give their samples, hoping to end the mystery. It was a time of renewed hope. Detectives who had nearly given up suddenly believed again. One said, "For 40 years, we have stared at his face and asked, 'Who are you?' Now science may finally answer." The newspapers brought the case back to life. TV stations covered the exhumation. Philadelphia was reminded once more of the forgotten child who had waited in silence. But then, the results came back. No matches. Not a single relative in the growing DNA databases matched the boy. Not one family connected. The boy had his DNA, yes. But still, he had no name. Once again, hope had risen. only to collapse into heartbreak. Detectives described the disappointment as devastating. For them, the exhumation had been a sacred moment. They had believed, truly believed, that DNA would reveal the boy's identity within months. Instead, the silence continued. The boy returned to his grave, still America's unknown child. The 1990s also saw new theories rise, fueled by the internet's early forums and true crime communities. People across the country debated, was the boy abandoned by wealthy parents hiding a scandal? Was he an immigrant child whose family never reported him missing? Was he hidden deliberately, part of a system that failed him? Theories flourished. But again, no hard evidence. By the end of the 1990s, the boy in the box had waited more than 40 years. Science had given him a voice, a DNA profile. But even that voice spoke into silence. And so the haunting question remained, how can a child exist and yet be so invisible? The new millennium arrived. The boy in the box had now been waiting more than 4 decades for someone to speak his name. But with the 2000s came a new kind of energy. The world had changed. The internet connected millions. True crime TV was exploding in popularity, and amateur sleuths had new platforms to share theories. And suddenly, a case that had nearly slipped into silence was alive again. Message boards, early forums, and websites dedicated to cold cases began buzzing about the boy in the box. Some were run by retired investigators, others by ordinary people fascinated by the mystery. For the first time, thousands of strangers from around the world could compare notes, study the photographs, trade theories. Some spotted details police had overlooked. Others chased wild speculation. The boy's face, once limited to newspaper clippings, was now on glowing screens, shared, reposted, analyzed by a new generation who had never even lived in the 1950s. He was no longer forgotten. Philadelphia. Authorities also felt the renewed pressure. A new generation of detectives reopened the dusty files, determined to carry the torch where the old guard had left off. For them, this was more than just a cold case. It was a chance to prove that modern policing and new science could do what decades of failure had not. They re-examined every lead, retested every sample, revisited every suspect, and as they did, strange new claims began to surface. One of the strangest leads came in the form of a woman, identified only as Martha. Martha claimed that as a child, her abusive mother had purchased a boy, and that boy was the one found in the box. She described years of horrific abuse and claimed she had witnessed the boy's death. For investigators, the story was chilling. Could it be true? But when they followed up, cracks appeared. Martha's mental health was unstable, and many of her details didn't match the evidence. In the end, her confession was set aside. But not before it stirred public fascination, and once again, the case returned to headlines. Television shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries featured the case, bringing it to millions of viewers. The photographs of the boy resurfaced. The haunting morgue images, once controversial, were shown to a new audience, many of whom had never heard of America's unknown child. Once again, tips poured in. Once again, every single one fell apart. In 1998, after the DNA exhumation, the boy had been reburied in a new resting place at Ivy Hill Cemetery. This time, the stone bore words chosen by the detectives themselves: America's unknown child. The detectives, the journalists, even strangers came to the new grave. They left flowers, toys, prayers. The boy still had no name. But he was no longer forgotten. Still, the weight of failure lingered. By the 2000s, almost every original investigator was gone. Some had died never knowing the truth. Others carried regret until their final days. The new detectives admitted they felt haunted. One said, "We've all raised our children, watched them grow. But he never got that chance. We owe him everything." The internet had reignited interest. New investigators had reopened the files. Strange confessions had drawn headlines. But even with all the noise, the truth remained just out of reach. And yet, hope was not gone. Because as science advanced, so too did DNA. And within the boy's tiny bones, answers still waited to be unlocked. By the 2010s, the boy in the box had been waiting more than half a century for someone to speak his name. 50 years of silence. 50 years of detectives coming and going. 50 years of theories, rumors, heartbreak. But then, science caught up with hope. DNA, once crude and limited, had evolved into something extraordinary. Now, it wasn't just about comparing samples in a police database. It was about building family trees from scratch. And for the first time, investigators realized the boy might finally come home. By the late 2010s, forensic genealogy had transformed cold case investigations. Using public DNA databases, experts could trace tiny strands of DNA back through generations, connecting long-dead relatives to living descendants. It was the same method that had identified the infamous Golden State Killer. And now, detectives decided it was time to try it on America's unknown child. The boy's tiny remains, already exhumed once in the 1990s, were studied again with more advanced techniques. This time, scientists extracted a cleaner, stronger DNA profile. Every fragment of genetic code was precious. Every letter of his DNA was a whisper from the past, waiting to be heard. The profile was uploaded into genealogical systems. And then, they waited. Slowly, the results began to appear. A second cousin here, a distant relative there. The connections were faint, scattered across multiple states. But they were enough for genealogists to begin the painstaking work of building backwards, generation by generation, family by family. For the first time, detectives had something more than theories. They had blood. They had kin. They had a family tree. Weeks turned into months. But the tree began to grow. Branches formed. Names appeared, and finally, the tree pointed to one family. A family from Pennsylvania. A family with a history of hardship. A family that had once had many children. And within that family was a boy who had simply disappeared. A boy whose name had never been spoken in public records again. The boy in the box was no longer faceless. He was someone's son. Someone's brother. Someone's blood. For detectives who had worked the case their whole lives, the news was overwhelming. Some cried. Some stood in silence. Some whispered prayers at the boy's grave. For decades they had promised him, "One day we will find your name." And now, after 65 long years, that promise was finally within reach. The city of Philadelphia buzzed with anticipation. Journalists sensed something big was happening. True crime communities online whispered of a breakthrough. But the investigators were careful. They wanted to be absolutely certain before speaking the words out loud. The boy had waited too long for mistakes. And then, at last, the day came. In 2022, the world would hear what Philadelphia detectives had whispered to themselves in quiet moments of prayer and obsession for decades. The boy in the box, America's unknown child, finally had a name. December 2022. It had been 65 years since a hunter stumbled upon a small, cardboard box in the woods outside Philadelphia. 65 years since detectives lifted the fragile body of a nameless child into their arms. For decades, he had been called many things: the boy in the box, America's unknown child, the forgotten son. But now, at last, he would be forgotten no more. Inside the Philadelphia Police Department, reporters gathered. Camera lights burned. Microphones waited. Detectives stood at the podium, some with trembling hands, others with wet eyes. And then, with a breath that seemed to carry the weight of generations, the words were spoken. America's unknown child has been identified. His name is Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The room went silent. For decades, the boy had been a ghost. But now he had a name: Joseph. Born in 1953. Only 4 years old when he died. He was not just a mystery. He was a son, a brother, a child who had deserved so much more. The detectives' voices cracked as they spoke. Some had worked their entire careers waiting for this day. Others had retired long ago, never to see it. But for those present, it felt like Joseph himself was finally standing there with them, not as a faceless boy, but as a child with an identity. The DNA had traced Joseph back to a Philadelphia family. He had siblings. He had relatives still alive, but the tragedy was layered. His parents, long gone, had never reported him missing. The question haunted everyone. Why? Why had no one spoken? Why had no one claimed him, even as his photograph was splashed across newspapers? That answer remains locked in the past, hidden with those who carried the secret to their graves. With Joseph's name, investigators had achieved what once seemed impossible. But justice? That was harder. The truth of who hurt him, who placed him in that box, may never fully be known. Still, detectives believe the answers may yet be uncovered. They are not giving up. One officer said, "Now that we know who he is, we will not stop until we know what happened to him." At Ivy Hill Cemetery, where Joseph had rested for decades beneath the stone marked America's unknown child, people gathered. This time, they whispered his real name, Joseph. They brought flowers. They brought toys. They brought prayers. For the first time, the boy who had once been faceless was embraced as he should have been in life. Loved. Joseph's story has become more than a tragedy. It is a testament to the detectives who refused to quit, to the strangers who left flowers on his grave, to the scientists who pushed technology to its limits, and to the idea that no child, no matter how forgotten, should ever remain nameless. Joseph Augustus Zarelli will forever be remembered, not just as a case file, but as a child who touched millions of hearts. The question still lingers: who took his life and why? But one truth is certain: Joseph is no longer lost. He has a name, he has a story. He has justice waiting, even if delayed. And after 65 years, the boy in the box is a boy no more. He is Joseph.